Welcome to Speaking of Men. You're watching public access television from Albuquerque, New Mexico. I'm your host, Mike Rivas. Joining me for the second part of a two-part program is Gary Lucas, a resident and father here in Albuquerque. And we're talking about pro se litigation. That is, fighting in the courts and representing yourself in the courtroom in a custody battle. Welcome back, Gary. It's enjoyed the last one. Maybe if we took a minute and caught some of the high points of the last show. You were saying that your main concern was that it's possible to lose a child because you have no common experience to create a bond, and you lost one from an earlier marriage, and you made your mind up that you just weren't going to let that happen to you again. If you're not a primary caregiver as a man, there's going to be a battle. You want to expound on that a little bit?
Well, I think there's going to be a battle anyway, simply because women do believe they have an exclusive right to children, and there's the precedent or the historical perspective that men are only providers and that women are only caregivers. So regardless of what you did during the marital relationship, you're going to have a custody battle simply because of the societal perspective that small children are given to women. The problem with that is that the disruption in the father-child relationship directly harms children as well as parents.
Now, you were required to make kind of a spiritual transformation and an emotional transformation as part of your gaining custody, and that was out of the fact that you had to face a number of false accusations of abuse and kidnapping, et cetera, and et cetera. You want to talk about some things you did to deal with that?
Well, there's several things you're asking there, and the way I would respond to it is, I think there's two things that goes on when a person finds themselves in a domestic relations battle, especially for men. Men have to find the internal resource to keep them in the fight, to keep them coming up with ideas that will overcome the
The
practice of discrimination in the domestic relations industry. There's not any, I don't think, any individuals who attempt to discriminate against men, but because of historical precedent, men are discriminated against. People do not want to investigate who's right or wrong. They want to get through with the case they're on and get to the case that's next in line. Therefore, when women are, the practice that women are using of making false allegations in order to put the men on the defense is effective because of men's lack of involvement or self-understanding about their own abilities to nurture. They find themselves unable to carry on the fight simply because they haven't developed the internal resource.
Yeah.
That's one thing. There's number two, and then which is to learn how to fight the battle of the domestic relations industry.
Those accusations are smokescreen to hide the real issue, which is what? That you're losing your relationship with your child.
Absolutely. Smokescreen in some cases. In some cases, as you pointed out last time, there is child abuse, and there is spousal abuse, and there are criminals. But there are an large number of ordinary people who simply want to maintain a relationship with their child, but are being accused of acts that just aren't true, simply to cloud the issues. Just
simply to cloud the issues. And the child loses. That was one of the things we were talking about last time.
The child loses, yeah.
One of the things you had to face was, of course, some of the stress of financial failure and loss of having a home. You know, the male is usually the person that's asked to leave the house. Let's talk a little bit about some of the things that you did to deal with some of these spiritual and emotional things that beset you during the time.
Fortunately, at that time, as I had indicated the last show, I was in the process of going through a transformation from that of being an unresolved male, of being stereotyped, of being angry, of pursuing the false gods that you hear men talking about nowadays. My worth was connected with my doing instead of my being. I was about to transition at the time that divorce was filed and about the time that my son came along. With a tremendous amount of therapy, introspection, and what happens to you when children are born, something comes over you regarding what your feelings are towards a new child, that I began to go through a transformation from being that angry man to becoming more of a human being. So we talked about it at length, so I don't want to waste the time too much today talking about it, but as a result of everything that was going on in my life, I did transition and start to get in touch with my inner life and start to become more of a healthy model of a functional human being. And we had discussed that was the primary influence, ingredient, resource that allowed me to fight for my child as effectively as I did.
Now, before we go on with the second part of the interview here, you ultimately had the court rule in your favor, didn't you? And how did it turn out? You guys took you about 2.5 years, but the court eventually thought that you'd be the best primary caregiver or custodian, and then you and your wife decided to share custody at that point, or?
Well, let me say it as accurately as I can. I want to say it accurately and honestly. Because of unsubstantiated allegations, I was put on the defensive for 2.5 years. To err on the side of safety, domestic relations professionals viewed me with suspicion, took very great care to make sure that they weren't creating a situation that was going to harm the child. During that 2.5 years, I did everything I could to make myself more knowledgeable, to make myself be able to present better to these professional psychologists. And what actually happened was that after 2.5 years, a situation came about where the court clinic did another evaluation on us, and after that evaluation, they recommended that I be the primary custodian to the child. My position had always been the child needed equal access to both parents, because I believed that I was only the object of my ex-wife's contempt, that I wasn't the source of it, that once I showed her that my relationship with my son was not a threat to her relationship with him, that hopefully she would calm down and we could co-parent. That's a word that has come out of domestic relations industry. Co-parenting means both parents come together for the sake of the child.
The domestic relations industry?
Mm-hmm. So using that word, that's not my word. It's from an author, maybe Wallerstein or Kelly. I'm not sure. And I've forgotten the second part of your question. So the court clinic recommended that I be the primary custodian. The mother then at that time offered 50-50. A better way to say it would be equal responsibility, that she have him as much time as I have him. I wanted to do that because of what I've just described to you. Hopefully it would bring the mother and I together to the point that we could co-parent the child, to celebrate the child's life in the presence of the child, to give the child the feeling that the people who brought him into the world love him and that they could find it within their hearts to be compatible for his sake. So, if I had not done that, the next step would have been for me to go in and to modify the court's order and try to get sole custody. I didn't think sole custody was in the best interest of the child. Court clinic then asked me to take a leap of faith. And so I did. And that was 8 or 9 months ago.
Okay, so although you have some background in legal matters, you obviously had to do a fair amount of research for handling a pro se case. How would you advise men to go about that kind of research?
Well, that's the second part of this. Once you have satisfied the condition of finding the internal resources to keep up this immense battle, this all-consuming situation, once you find the internal resources to continue to do that, then the next step is how do you practice domestic relations law? Well, you don't ever I will be the biggest fool that walks through the courthouse doors each and every time I go in. But you simply start from step one and try to acquaint yourself with everything you can acquaint yourself with. Rules of civil procedure, rules of evidence, how hearings are conducted. Buy yourself Chapter 40 of the New Mexico statutes and read the damn thing. Hell, it's about that thick and it's the driest reading in the world. But these are some of the things you have to do. Read all the child psychology you can read. You want to try to focus in on the things that are most pertinent, so you can, as you look, you will decide which writings are a little more pertinent to your situation than others. Also, while you're reading about the law, you will see how the judges and the lawyers think about it, and you can start to adjust yourself to the concepts instead of thinking that the legal industry should adjust themselves to you. After you read several thousand pages and spend several 100-hour weeks, at least you will be able to start to present yourself a little better to the people who will be on your case, namely psychologists.
What are the most surprising things that you discovered during your research, or do you have some of the things that maybe amazed you?
Thinking about that question is the greatest discovery I found was that in the face of overwhelming adversity, that something inside of me continued to provide me answers, or at least continued to provide me a question that made me go find an answer, that kept me asking enough questions that I kept looking for answers. That's what I discovered, is that within me there was a strong resource that would not let the negative parts of domestic relations overwhelm me, overcome me, defeat me, keep me from continuing the fight to preserve the father-child relationship.
So you definitely have to make a time commitment. 100-hour week is a long week of research and
right
and delving. How did you go about preparing for the court appearance itself, for instance?
I have many times taken an attorney with me, hired him for that hour, or out of pity, an attorney that I would know would offer themselves for a simple hearing to simply say, Your Honor, this is we don't think this is right, and they would change it to something else. But there has been several times that I've appeared by myself. Preparing for court, rules of evidence, rules of civil procedure, but going and reading Chapter 40, and then taking the cases that are annotated and going to American Jurisprudence or ALR and reading the annotations, reading Family Law Quarterly, reading the magazines that come out that lawyers read that give them the concepts on how to present their cases, going to court, sitting through many hearings, seeing who goes first, who goes second, what they do then. You can go to court. You can do those things. You've got to do those things. So for preparing for court, I did everything within my power. Never has there been a time that I was completely prepared for court, because never has there been a time that I have been completely knowledgeable about how all this works. That leads you to the main thing about this, is that you're never going to be an informed person who can act as efficiently and effectively and as knowledgeably as an attorney. So don't even try. Learn as much as you can, but the bottom line is that you adapt yourself to what is the truth. You adapt yourself to what are the current concepts, and you simply go in and tell the judge what you believe the story to be. If you pretend that you know more, or if you go through some sort of shame spiral inside of you that tells you, well, I really don't have the knowledge to do this, that means they're going to find out that I'm not an effective person. If you're going through that kind of a head trip, you're not going to be able to focus in on the things you need. I'm rambling a little bit, but primarily you need to focus in on what is the truth. I am a worthy human being. That is my child out there. If I know that if I don't preserve the relationship with that child is going to be predictably, insidiously injured. The only thing I can really do is to read everything I can read, listen to everything I can listen to, and then stand up in front of the judge and try to be as honest as I can possibly be.
Is documentation of events and occurrences and conversations important?
Definitely. Everyone has a different case. I can only talk from the circumstances regarding my case. I had a spouse who desired to treat me maliciously and who desired to subvert the father-child relationship. In doing so, allegation after allegation after allegation was made about me that I had to defend. I found that the only way that I could keep up with the volume, the great volume of it, was to keep a diary. As a result, I've got several hundred pages of diary. What that gives you the ability to do is to go back through and to pull out and say, well, there's been so many violations of the court order, there's been so many situations where good relations have not been fostered, there's been so many incidents of alienation of affection. And it starts to clear your mind up of all the details and instead give you a general understanding about what has taken place. Then you can dispense with having to think about that and start to concentrate on what is important. Your Honor or Doctor, I am a good parent. I am able to respond to that child unconditionally because of my emotional maturity. I am able to pursue the continuity of care for that child. I am able to do the things that you're reading about that judges believe are important, that psychologists believe are important. So, documentation, yeah. The other thing is offer of proof, especially child support hearings. An attorney has deposed you, gotten all your information, you go into court thinking you can tell the special master, Your Honor, this is how much money I make, thinking that's going to be as simple as it is. And this attorney pulls out of context a document that gives the judge the belief that you're making more money than you are. So, offer of proof. Everything that you state, have a document to back it up. Everything that you anticipate that you're going to have to refute, have a document to back it up. You're not always going to be able to satisfy that need, but try to. I've got 3 big storage boxes full of my divorce file. I've got hundreds of hours of tape. So, offer of proof, a diary, very important, and try to acquaint yourself with rules of evidence, rules of civil procedure. You only can do that once you've made the commitment to fight pro se, when you don't have the money to hire an attorney, when the consequences of not fighting and preserving the father-child relationship is that not only you lose out in a loving relationship with the child, but the child is sentenced to predictable, insidious effects of abandonment, inadvertently, to domestic relations.
What would some of those be?
Well, I'm not qualified to talk about any of it, but from what I read is that inadvertent abandonment in domestic relations affects a child's self-esteem. Codependency, addiction, compulsive behavior are all the same illness. That it has to do with your self-esteem, that you feel that you are inadequate. One of the needs that children need is to belong. If the parent is forced out of that child's relationship, many times the children's ego state begins to say that there's something wrong with them, that they weren't lovable, or that they caused it, or whatever. Once again, I don't want to imply that I'm qualified to talk about this, because I can only tell you what I've read.
But you definitely feel that the consequences of a young man or a woman not having access to both parents or having both parents around is damaging.
Yes, and I can prove that out by the deterministic effect that losing my father had in my childhood. The toxic shame, as Bradshaw calls it. I began to think that there was something wrong with me. That all began with my mother and father breaking up, the loss of my father, the mentorship that men are talking about now, the loss of that, just the loss of a parent who wanted to love me.
You know, one of the real problems in a divorce is the amount of emotionally charged situations that bring men and women together. A lot of them violent emotion and stuff. How important is it to maintain control over your own emotions during court appearances, for instance?
Part of the criterion in a judge's order is the demeanor of the parties. That's a little a little paragraph. I've observed the demeanor of the parties. If you've got, if you're flailing your arms and screaming at the judge, he's not going to be able to remain impartial towards you. If you're standing in front of him and if you do have an emotional plea, that's one thing. But not able to maintain some control will tell the judge that you may not have the prerequisites to care for a small child. So it's no harder to talk to a judge than it is for me to talk to you on camera. The bottom line is you don't want the relationship with your child to be destroyed, and you try to stand up and tell the judge why it's important that that not occur. Do your reading of the law and of the child's psychology in order to give yourself a better presentation.
So you don't want to get into any blame, they did this to me, can't you see how unfair life is kinds of things.
Well, but sometimes you can't separate all that.
Right, right.
Especially when the other side has said, Your Honor, the respondent has blah, blah, blah. You're going to have to give some sort of defense. But try to get that organized as much as possible so that you can be done with it and get to the important part, which is, Your Honor, I am the most important parent.
Any keys to creating that kind of communication?
With an attorney, or with a judge?
A judge, or, I mean, how, you know, communication skills for men's a big, well, I don't know how big a topic it is, but it's certainly something that, that we talk about from time to time. Is there, you got any insights on the importance of communication skills on the parts of men? I mean, attorneys do it very well. I don't know how well the average guy does, but...
I think that you've probably described what's happening with men in their inability to get in touch with their inner life. The lack of being in touch with their inner life creates a situation where it makes it difficult to communicate feelings. Having an emotional relationship with a child is important. I don't know where our time is, but there's three things here.
We're just fine.
We are, okay. There's four things here that I think is important to know. In order to have some influence on where the child goes in a custody situation, you've got to have a primary care relationship with the child during the marital relationship. If after the divorce you come up and tell the court clinic, but Your Honor, but doctor, I want to be a primary caregiver, but I wasn't during the marriage, the court clinic are not apt to let you be the primary caregiver. Number two, if you don't have time to execute the primary caregiver role, that's another thing that's going to go against you. If you've got to be out on your coast-to-coast truck route, they're not going to let you be a primary caregiver. What I have compared all of my activities to and all of my decisions on is how will this affect the bonding with my child. If I were to say, well, I must go out and make $100,000 this year to be a man, that wouldn't be good for the bonding with my child, right? Or if I was to make some decision to say, I want to try to force the mother out of this relationship, how will that affect the bonding with my child? Well, you're hurting your child by forcing the other parent out. So I always use how does this affect the bonding with my child to see if the decision I am making is in the best interest of the child. The next thing is that of these more important conditions is that men who have never been through this before begin to feel that they may be injuring their child by fighting for the child. What I would like to tell men is that right now is just an intermediate process. The injury that occurs now is just something that's going to have to be, because what happens in the long run, the predictable, insidious effects of losing a child is far more damaging to a child than are the intermediate, short-term fighting for the child. Ideally, try to some way to bring the mother and the father together so they can co-parent, but when you can't, you can't.
Was that all four of them?
That was all four of them, I believe, yeah.
What impact did the divorce have on your life personally?
Well, it's any momentum I had built up at 40 years old was destroyed. As far as a finance, business, where I would like to be at 45 was all destroyed. But what better cause is there than to preserve a relationship with children?
Do you think that's something that you think a lot of, I know we were talking about the fact that men are the ones that are forced to move out of the home usually, so they lose their home right away. If they're in a business situation, trying to work for themselves or for others, the emotional impact of that. Business isn't too sympathetic for men going through emotional, you know, if you can't toughen up and cut it, you can just get down the road.
Sure.
Do you feel that it's not unusual for men to have their lives destroyed because of divorce?
No, it's not. And generally speaking, I see many men whose lives are completely upset, and especially when you hear about the hard cases where there was homicide or suicide or incarceration, certainly. Men and women have the same problems when it comes to working and taking care of children, I think.
We touched on this last time, but I think something that's important to both of us is the fact that we feel that it is the child that's important in this. You know, we're two men sitting here saying that we feel that in the long run there should be some attempt on the part of both men and women and on the part of the courts to create a situation where children are not the losers and the emotional pawns in these huge damaging battles that Gary, Jake was going to come on and spend a couple of minutes with us. Jake, you want to come on up and say hi?
Come here, buddy. This is Jacob Lucas. This is my little boy. On a farm in Alameda, and Jakey has donkeys and geese and ducks and a chicken and new spurs.
I didn't know you had a donkey. Do you ride him?
No.
No? Anybody you want to say hi to?
You say hi to Mommy?
Just look right in this camera and say, hi, Mom.
Where's Mommy?
She's not. She's on TV. She'll see you on TV.
I see me, I did.
Okay.
Well, this is Speaking of Men, coming to you from Albuquerque, New Mexico. We'd like to thank you for joining Gary and Jake and I today. God bless. Don't quit. Come back, see us again. It's been a pleasure having you. Check your local listings for the next time and place we meet. Bye-bye.